Picture this: 300 guests packed into a wedding hall. The bride, in her pristine white gown, stands at the altar waiting for what should be the most beautiful moment of her life. But instead of vows of love, she hears words that would shatter her world forever. The deal is off. You haven't paid enough. In front of everyone she knows, her future in-laws grab her by the arm and drag her out of her own wedding. Her veil catches on a chair, and tears. Guests pull out their phones to record, but nobody moves to help. Nobody speaks up. The woman who spent 2 years planning this day, who sold her grandmother's jewelry to afford the perfect dress, is being treated like a piece of merchandise that didn't meet the asking price. But what none of them expected was that one person in that crowd had seen enough, and that person was about to change everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Sarah Chen, 24 years old, a kindergarten teacher from a small town in Ohio where everyone knows everyone else's business. Sarah came from a hard-working family. Her father, Mike, worked double shifts at the local manufacturing plant. Her mother, Linda, cleaned houses to make ends meet. And Sarah herself had been saving every penny from her teaching salary for this wedding. She met David Martinez 2 years ago at a community college graduation party. He was charming, well-educated, and came from what everyone called a good family. His parents owned 3 successful restaurants in town, drove luxury cars, and lived in the kind of house with a circular driveway that Sarah had only seen in movies. When David proposed, Sarah thought she was living a fairy tale, but David's family had different ideas about what marriage meant. To them, a wedding wasn't just about love. It was about tradition, status, and most importantly, what the bride's family could bring to the table. From the very beginning, something felt off. There were whispers in restaurant corners, conditions being quietly negotiated behind closed doors, and a price being placed on what should have been priceless. Sarah's parents, desperate to see their daughter happy, began making sacrifices they couldn't afford. They took out loans, sold possessions, and borrowed money from relatives just to meet the Martinez family's expectations. For 6 months, Sarah threw herself into wedding planning with the kind of joy that only comes from believing you're about to marry your soulmate. She spent hours scrolling through Pinterest, creating the perfect vision of their special day. She tasted dozens of cakes, tried on dress after dress, and even learned to make David's grandmother's traditional tamales because she wanted to feel like part of his family. But while Sarah was dreaming of her future, David's mother, Elena, was making lists of her own, lists of what the Chen family should provide. First, it was contributions to the reception costs. Then, it was specific gifts for the extended family. Then, it came the suggestion that Sarah's parents should help David with a down payment on a house. Each request felt reasonable when explained individually. "It's just tradition," Elena would say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "David's grandmother expects it." Sarah's parents wanted their daughter to be accepted, so they said yes to everything. Mike worked overtime until his back ached constantly. Linda took on extra cleaning jobs until her hands were raw and cracked. Sarah watched her parents grow thinner and more exhausted, but every time she suggested they were doing too much, they would insist they were happy to help. "Anything for your happiness, mija," her father would say, using the Spanish endearment he'd learned just to make her feel more connected to David's culture. The warning signs were there, but love has a way of making us blind to red flags. David himself seemed uncomfortable when his mother made her requests, but he never spoke up to defend Sarah or her family. "You know how my mom is," he'd say with a helpless shrug. "It's easier just to go along with it." Sarah told herself that once they were married, things would be different. Once they had their own home, their own life, David would find his backbone. But what Sarah didn't know was that her wedding day would become the stage for a humiliation so calculated and cruel that it would change her life forever. And what the Martinez family didn't realize was that their greed was about to be exposed in the most public way possible. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful. Sarah woke up in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by her bridesmaids, feeling like she was floating on air. Her dress fit perfectly, her makeup was flawless, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman ready to start the next chapter of her life. The ceremony was set for 4 o'clock at St. Mary's Community Center, the same place where her parents had their wedding reception 30 years earlier. By 3:30, 300 guests had filled the decorated hall. Sarah's side was packed with teachers from her school, neighbors who had watched her grow up, and relatives who had traveled from across the country to celebrate with her. But as Sarah stood in the bridal suite, adjusting her veil one last time, David's uncle Roberto burst through the door without knocking. His face was hard, his voice cold. "There's a problem," he announced to Sarah and her bridesmaids. "Your family hasn't met their obligations." Sarah felt the room spin. "What obligations? What are you talking about?" Roberto's words came like blows. The final payment for the reception hadn't been made. The gifts for the extended family were insufficient, and David's grandmother was insulted by what she called the Chen family's lack of respect. Sarah's father was summoned from the main hall, still wearing his rented tuxedo, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. "I paid everything we agreed on," Mike said, his voice shaking. "I have the receipts." But Elena Martinez had emerged from somewhere, flanked by several male relatives, her voice rising loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Agreements change," she declared. "If your family can't provide what's expected, then perhaps your daughter isn't ready for marriage." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She looked around desperately for David, for someone to stand up for her, to tell his family this was insane. But David was nowhere to be found. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every person in that room. Elena and Roberto, along with 2 other men Sarah didn't recognize, took hold of her arms and began dragging her toward the exit. Sarah's wedding dress, the dress she had saved 8 months to buy, caught on decorations and began to tear. Her carefully arranged hair fell loose. Her makeup began to run as tears of shock and humiliation streamed down her face. The 300 wedding guests sat in stunned silence, some pulling out phones to record, others whispering behind their hands, but not one person stood up to intervene. Sarah could hear her mother screaming her name, could see her father being held back by more of David's relatives, and through it all, David was still nowhere to be. But there was one person in that crowd who had seen enough. Margaret Thompson was David's second-grade teacher from 15 years ago, now retired and in her 70s. She had been invited because David's mother wanted to maintain the image that their family was beloved by everyone who knew them. Margaret had taught in the same community for 40 years. She had seen generations of families grow up, had witnessed every kind of drama the small town could produce, but she had never seen anything like this. As Sarah was being dragged past her table, something inside Margaret snapped, "Stop!" The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to someone who had spent decades commanding the attention of rowdy second-graders. Margaret Thompson stood up from her chair, all 4 feet 11 inches of her, and pointed directly at Elena Martinez. "I know exactly what this is about, and everyone in this room deserves to know the truth." The dragging stopped. Sarah found herself standing in the middle of the hall, her torn dress and smeared makeup making her look like a victim in a crime scene. Margaret's voice carried across the now silent room with the kind of authority that made everyone lean forward to listen. "Elena Martinez, I taught your son 15 years ago, and I remember exactly what kind of family you are." Margaret's words were measured, deliberate, devastating. "This isn't about tradition or respect. This is about greed, pure and simple. You've been bleeding this girl's family dry for months." Margaret turned to address the entire room, her teacher's instincts taking over. "How many of you know that the Chen family took out a second mortgage on their house to pay for this wedding? How many of you know that Sarah's mother has been working 7 days a week cleaning houses to meet this family's demands?" A murmur began to ripple through the crowd. People were looking at each other, putting pieces together, beginning to understand what they were really witnessing. But Margaret wasn't finished. "And Elena, since you want to talk about family honor, Let's talk about the reason your nephew Carlos's wedding was called off last year. Let's talk about the police reports. Let's talk about the restraining order." The color drained from Elena's face. Carlos, standing near the back of the hall, began moving toward the exit. Margaret had just exposed something the Martinez family had spent a year trying to keep quiet. The crowd's murmur became a buzz, then grew louder. People were no longer just witnessing Sarah's humiliation. They were seeing a pattern of behavior, a family that used marriage as a business transaction and intimidation as a negotiating tactic. In that moment, with 300 pairs of eyes watching, with her dress torn and her dreams shattered, Sarah found something she didn't know she had: her voice. "Mrs. Martinez," Sarah said, and her words carried clearly across the silent room. "You're right. I'm not ready for this marriage, not to your son, not to your family, and not to a lifetime of being treated like something you can buy and sell." Sarah looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. Teachers who had encouraged her, neighbors who had watched her grow up, friends who loved her. "I am not a transaction. I am not a piece of property. I am a human being with dignity, and I will not be dragged around like merchandise that didn't meet your price expectations." The transformation was visible. Sarah straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and wiped the makeup streaks from her cheeks. "You want to know what's insulting, Mrs. Martinez? It's not my family's financial situation. It's your belief that love should come with a price tag." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "My parents worked themselves to exhaustion trying to make you happy. They borrowed money they don't have, sold things that meant everything to them, all so their daughter could marry a man she loved. And your response is to humiliate us in front of everyone we know?" David finally appeared from wherever he had been hiding, looking pale and confused. "Sarah, what's going on? Mom, what are you doing?" But it was too late for David to play the innocent bystander. Sarah turned to face the man she had planned to spend her life with, and her voice was steady as steel. "David, your family just dragged me out of our wedding because they decided my parents haven't paid them enough money for the privilege of me marrying you. Where were you? Where have you been for the past 6 months while they demanded more and more from my family?" David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His silence was the loudest answer Sarah could have received. Margaret Thompson, still standing at her table, began to clap. Slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the hall. One by one, others joined in. Sarah's students' families, her neighbors, people who had watched the Martinez family's behavior with growing discomfort, all began to applaud. It started quietly, but grew into something that sounded like thunder. They were applauding Sarah's courage, her dignity, her refusal to be diminished by people who confused wealth with worth. The Martinez family left the hall in chaos, taking David with them, but the damage to their reputation was already spreading like wildfire. In a town where everyone knows everyone, news travels fast, and by evening, the story was everywhere. Social media posts, text message chains, conversations in grocery store aisles. But while Sarah had found her voice and her strength, the consequences were immediate and harsh. The Chen family was left with thousands of dollars in debt from wedding expenses that would never be recouped. Friends and neighbors, while supportive, couldn't change the financial reality that Mike and Linda now faced. The social pressure was intense in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Some people praised her courage, but others whispered that she had embarrassed both families, that she should have handled things privately. "Marriage requires compromise," some of the older women in town said. Maybe she was too proud. The blame somehow managed to find its way back to Sarah, as it often does when women refuse to accept mistreatment quietly. Even worse, David began reaching out to her, sending text messages and leaving voicemails claiming he had been blindsided by his family's behavior, that he loved her and wanted to work things out. "Sarah, I had no idea my mom was going to do that," he said in one message. "I was getting dressed. I didn't know what was happening until it was too late." But Sarah had begun to see patterns she had missed before. David's convenient absences whenever his family made demands, his refusal to set boundaries with his mother, his assumption that Sarah and her parents would always accommodate whatever was asked of them. She realized that David's silence wasn't weakness or surprise. It was complicity. He had allowed his family to treat her like a commodity because he saw her the same way. The legal situation was complicated. While dowry harassment was illegal in many countries, American law didn't have specific protections against the kind of financial coercion the Chen family had experienced. Sarah's father consulted with a lawyer, but was told that unless they could prove criminal fraud or extortion, their options were limited. The Martinez family had been careful to frame their demands as traditions and voluntary contributions. Meanwhile, the debt remained, the humiliation lingered, and Sarah had to face the reality that standing up for herself had come with a price her family could barely afford. Margaret Thompson, the retired teacher who had spoken up, became an unexpected ally. She had lived in the town long enough to know which families operated with integrity and which ones didn't. She began quietly spreading the word about other young women who had dealt with similar pressure from the Martinez family, creating a network of people who had been too intimidated to speak up before. What had seemed like an isolated incident was beginning to look like a pattern of behavior that had been hidden for years. 3 months after the wedding that never was, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She contacted the local newspaper and asked to tell her story publicly, not for revenge, not to shame anyone, but to shine a light on a problem that was hiding in plain sight. The reporter, Maria Santos, was initially skeptical. Newspaper stories about failed weddings weren't typically front-page material, but as Sarah explained what had happened, and as Maria began to investigate, they discovered that Sarah's experience was part of something much larger. The story that ran the following Sunday was titled, "The Price of Love: When Marriage Becomes a Business Transaction." It featured interviews with Sarah and her family, testimony from Margaret Thompson, and comments from other families who had experienced similar pressure in marriage negotiations. The Martinez family declined to comment, but the article included details about the pattern of behavior that multiple sources had confirmed. David's cousin Carlos, whose own wedding had been canceled under suspicious circumstances, finally agreed to speak on the record about his experience. The article hit the small town like an earthquake. People who had attended the wedding, who had witnessed Sarah's humiliation, began to speak up about what they had seen. The silence that had protected families like the Martinezes for years began to crack. Social media amplified the story beyond the town's borders. Sarah began receiving messages from women across the country who had experienced similar situations, who had been pressured to accept financial demands from potential in-laws, who had been made to feel like their worth was tied to what their families could provide. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah was invited to speak at the monthly town council meeting. The room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Sarah stood at the podium, wearing a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back, looking nothing like the broken bride who had been dragged from her wedding just months before. "I'm not here to destroy anyone's reputation," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here because silence protects the wrong people." She spoke about the pressure young couples face, about families who use tradition as a weapon, about the difference between cultural respect and financial exploitation. "If my humiliation prevents even one other woman from going through what I experienced, then it was worth it," Sarah said, "because nobody's love should come with a price tag, and nobody's dignity should be for sale." The room erupted in applause that lasted for minutes, and Sarah realized that her voice had become something more powerful than her individual pain. It had become a catalyst for change. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Sarah's life looked completely different, but in ways she had never expected. The debt from the wedding expenses was still there, but the community had rallied around the Chen family in ways that restored Sarah's faith in human decency. A GoFundMe page organized by her former students' parents had raised enough money to pay off the wedding venue and catering costs. Local businesses donated services for a debt consolidation plan that made the remaining payments manageable. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered a purpose she never knew she was looking for. She began volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped families understand their rights in marriage negotiations. She spoke at community centers and college campuses about recognizing financial coercion in relationships. Her story had resonated far beyond her small town, and Sarah found herself becoming an advocate for something she had never planned to care about. The shy kindergarten teacher who had once been afraid to speak up to her future mother-in-law was now confidently addressing audiences about dignity, self-respect, and the courage to walk away from situations that diminish your worth. David made several attempts to reconcile, each one revealing more about his character than Sarah wanted to know. He claimed his family had pressured him, that he had been caught between his love for Sarah and his loyalty to his parents. But Sarah had learned to listen to actions rather than words. David had had multiple opportunities to defend her, to set boundaries with his family, to prioritize their relationship over his mother's demands. His silence during her humiliation had been a choice, not an accident. When he finally stopped calling, Sarah felt relief rather than sadness. The Martinez family's reputation in the community never fully recovered. Their restaurant still operated, but many families quietly chose to celebrate their special occasions elsewhere. Elena Martinez was no longer invited to the same social events, no longer held the same influence in community organizations. Carlos, David's cousin, had eventually shared his own story about being pressured to demand money from his fiancée's family and about choosing to break the pattern rather than continue it. The family's behavior, once hidden behind closed doors and cultural traditions, was now part of the public record. Margaret Thompson, the retired teacher who had spoken up at the wedding, became a close friend and mentor to Sarah. "I've seen a lot of courage in my 40 years of teaching," Margaret told her one afternoon over coffee. "But what you did in that moment, standing up for yourself when everyone was watching, that was something special. You turned your worst day into your strongest moment." Sarah realized that Margaret was right. The wedding that was supposed to be the happiest day of her life had actually become the day she discovered who she really was. Today, Sarah Chen works as a kindergarten teacher by day and a community advocate by evening. She speaks at workshops about healthy relationships, volunteers with legal aid organizations, and has helped dozens of families navigate the complex pressures that can turn love into a business transaction. She never married, but she also never regretted walking away from a marriage that would have cost her everything she valued about herself. Her parents, Mike and Linda, are proud of the woman their daughter became, even though it took her being dragged out of her own wedding to discover her strength. The community center where Sarah's wedding was supposed to take place now hosts monthly meetings for families dealing with similar pressures. The room where she was humiliated has become a place of healing and empowerment for others. Sarah often looks at that space and remembers the scared young woman in the torn wedding dress who thought her life was ending. She wishes she could tell that woman that it was actually the moment her real life began. Sometimes people ask Sarah if she ever thinks about what would have happened if she had just gone along with the Martinez family's demands, if she had married David and tried to make the best of it. "I think about the woman I would have become," Sarah says. "Someone who learned that her value was negotiable, that her dignity was something other people could buy and sell. That woman would have spent her entire marriage apologizing for taking up space in her own life." Instead, Sarah became someone who refuses to let anyone else determine her worth. Because sometimes it takes being dragged out of the life you thought you wanted to discover the life you actually deserve. And sometimes it only takes one voice in the crowd speaking the truth to change everything. What do you think? Was justice truly served in Sarah's story, or do situations like this reveal deeper problems in how we think about love, marriage, and family obligations? Have you ever witnessed someone being pressured to accept treatment that diminished their dignity? How would you have reacted if you had been in that wedding hall, watching Sarah being dragged away? Let us know in the comments. And if this story gripped you like it did us, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful true stories every week.